I mean, we could go into a long discussion about that, but what it means there isn't private property is quite complicated. But I think by far the most important thing is that people who control the most resources have no guarantee that they're going to get it back if they give it to anyone else. And so it just leads to concentration of wealth in very small hands and the employment of people who are connected with those rich people. So in general, this problem of incentives, the principal agent problem, is a very general problem that shows up all over economics, and it's something we're going to be discussing throughout the course. So I'm going to go over it pretty briefly and pretty informally right now, but it's something we'll keep coming back to. Okay, so the essence of management is the principal agent problem. So when, if you go and get an MBA, really what you're learning to do is to motivate people to get work done, right? And that happens in a lot of different ways. So Jeff Bollinger, can you give me some examples of ways companies motivate people to work?
So I guess in general, sort of surveillance, for lack of a better term. I guess particularly for low-level workers.
Surveillance?
If you watch people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, I remember reading about this in economics, and apparently it doesn't always work too well, but stock options.
Yeah. So those are some good examples, and those are the classic examples, actually, of what economists usually emphasize. So Jeff hit on sort of the first two things on my list. First of all, equity and stock options. Stock options is the right to buy a stock at some price, and equity is the actual shares in the company, are a way of incentivizing people to work harder. But there are lots of other ways to incentivize people to work harder, and there's actually a lot of problems with giving them just equity and stock options or other financial instruments. So another way you can do it is you can do what's called vesting or deferred or contingent compensation. That is, we don't give you just equity in the company, but rather than paying you a salary, we put some money into a pool, and we say only if the company doesn't blow up in 5 years do you get this money. Or only if X doesn't happen, or only after a certain period of time will you get this money that we've paid to you. So that's another form of, and one version of this is giving the money to the person, but then making them personally liable for things that happen, or having what's called a clawback provision, which is you give them money, but then if something really terrible happens to the company, you can take the money back from them, right? Another way is direct monitoring, as Jeff mentioned. So you can just directly monitor what people are doing, and you get mad at them if they don't do it. Give them instructions, watch over them. That's the role that a lot of managers or foremen play at lower level jobs. But then we start to get we're going to gradually get to sort of things that economists talk about less, but which play an important role as well, if not a more important role. So one is lawsuits and audits. So if a company's doing something bad, they might get audited, or their shareholders might bring a lawsuit against them for not doing a good job. Another thing that you might do is someone might be afraid of losing their job, right? They might really value their job. So that might give you a reason to make the job actually pay really well, even if the person isn't worth it, just to make sure they're really afraid of losing their job so that they won't screw up in any way, right? So that's called the efficiency wage idea. Another thing that you might do is give people bonuses. And those could be based on actual performance in some measurable way, or they could just be based on your boss's subjective evaluation of how well you've done on the job. Another thing that is very important motivator is people's reputation, right? They want to get a reputation for being a hard worker so that they'll be hired by other firms. And information about their reputation may flow, and that gives them an incentive to work harder. Another, again, this is getting even softer, but I think these things play a really important role in motivation, is the fact that some companies try to foster a culture or a vision of what the company is all about. And they try to create a culture of innovation or whatever it is that the company stands for. And this can, if they can sort of drill this into people's minds, people sort of think what it means to be a professor at the University of Chicago is to be intellectually engaged, right? And I say, I'm a University of Chicago professor, I really want to be engaged. And that motivates me to go to meetings with my colleagues and so forth, because I internalize that as part of who I am as a human being. And so I think that's actually a very important motivator, and especially in the professions, they spend a huge amount of time drilling doctors and other professionals in what it is to be a doctor, right? And that's a huge motivator, I actually think, for the way that people do their work, to the extent that it succeeds, at least. Similarly, a leader at the head of a company can be very important. So someone like Steve Jobs, I think, really inspires the people who work for him. And just by showing them sort of a vision, he's able to get them to work harder because they sort of aspire to please him or to follow his leadership and be part of the enterprise that he's engaging in. And that can be positive, that can work through respect, as I think it does for Jobs, but it can also work through fear. So if you're just absolutely terrified of your boss, right, even if he's not going to fire you directly, but you're just terrified of him, you can just be afraid and want to work harder so you don't disappoint him. Another opposite type of thing, which I think is very important at Google, is sort of this idea that people have intrinsic motivation to do things that they just aspire to do on their own, and those may be good things for the company. So for example, at Google, one day out of every week you get to just work on some project that's not related to the main thing that you're doing. And I think that people at Google thinks that works really well because it inspires people to be creative, and these are people who they've selected who really want to sort of innovate and so forth. And so that sort of intrinsic motivation can be a very important part of a company's development. Another thing that can be important is, if you hire people within your family, or if the people at the company are related to one another, they can do it because they want to help out their family. And a very important form of motivation, especially in the military, is the fact that they try to develop very close ties among people. So even if they're not loyal to the cause, even if they don't care whether we win in Iraq, they want to protect their friends, right? And that leads them to work harder, and that leads them, to be courageous because they don't want their friends to die. So that can be a very important form of motivation as well. So again, economists like to sort of cut things off here a lot of the time, and they like to think about these hard incentives, but in a lot of cases, some of these softer incentives are just as important complementary motivators. Okay, so what sorts of problems are these incentives used to solve? Well, let me give you some example. One major problem is embezzlement, just stealing from the company, right? And this is actually a lot more common than you might think it is. This is the primary reason, actually, why there's security cameras at most, convenience stores. It's not because they're afraid of being stolen from someone outside. It's that they're afraid of being stolen from by their own workers. And in fact, apparently the main reason why it makes sense for there to be credit cards, someone did a study on this, is how much people at the stores would steal from the cash register if there was a bunch of cash just sitting there. And this is an even worse problem in developing countries. I mean, it's the primary problem you have when you have a business, is you're afraid that people are just going to steal from you. Another problem is what economists call shirking, not working hard enough. So this can either be just like blatantly not coming to work, or not, trying, but it can also be not really being focused, not thinking about your work, not really being engaged with it, not really being prepared when you come into work to get things done. There's also major problems of taking too much or sometimes too little risk. So this is a huge problem for a lot of the Wall Street banks, as we saw during the crisis. And in fact, there was just another blow up at the UBS, which is a big Swiss bank, has this guy who basically went and he was trying to make a bunch of money because he wanted to move up. He was very low on the totem pole. He wanted to move up, right? He didn't see that he had much downside to lose because if he lost money on some big trade, the company would pay for it. But if he gained it, he would become famous within the company and he'd move up, right? So his incentives were to take on this huge risk, and he sort of blew up his company as a result of that, right? So you can have bad incentives for too much risk-taking, but you could also have an incentive for too little risk-taking. So if the manager is very risk-averse, really wants to hold on to the position, if there's someone who's advanced at the company and is really afraid of losing their job if anything goes wrong, they might not want to take any of the risks which might be needed for the company to succeed. And this is a big problem, is companies are constantly choosing how ambitious the projects they take on should be. Another similar problem is companies may be too focused on the short term in some cases. Other less traditional incentive problems have become of interest to economists recently. One is called empire building. And this is the idea that many managers seek after glory or fame, or like they want to have a big company and they want to be the president of a really famous company, rather than serving the interests of maximizing the profits of their shareholders. And in fact, there's a number of studies that have shown most mergers are actually wasteful and are just an attempt by the manager to get control over more stuff. So, Anthony's on? Yeah, Anthony. What incentives of that big list of incentives that I gave, which ones do you think might work well or not so well against empire building?
You could directly monitor them, but I mean, like if all mergers had to be approved, then they would have no way to do it.
Yeah, so that's one approach to take. That's right. I think also, giving someone an equity stake can be a pretty good way of disincentivizing empire building, because then they have more of an interest in the profits of the company. But actually, a lot of the softer incentives can actually be really bad for empire building. So if you think about intrinsic motivation or mission, that's exactly what leads someone to want to be an empire builder. If they believe in the mission of the company, that's almost bad, right? Because then they're going to they're like, well, we've got to take over the whole world. We're the best company ever, right? Rather than just thinking about the profits of their shareholders. Another problem is what economists often call multitasking, and this happens when there are some outcomes that are easy to measure and other outcomes that are hard to measure. So my favorite example of this is that in Colombia, the government instituted a program that they would pay, and they do this in Afghanistan too, that they would pay the military for each insurgent that they brought back killed. So, of course, what happened is they just started slaughtering people in the countryside and dressing them up as insurgents and like bringing them back for their ransom, right? So if you can't monitor whether you're killing a bad guy or a good guy, right, then this obviously isn't going to work very well, right? And so a more common example of this is that often, salespeople can be monitored for how many house loans they give, say. But they can't be monitored for whether the people that they're giving the house loans to are like a crack addict, or whether there's actually a chance that they'll pay back the loan, right? And so if you can't monitor that, giving incentives for something like selling a lot of loans can actually be counterproductive, because it leads you to focus so much on what can be measured and not enough on what can't be measured. Ben, what do you think? What types of incentives do you think would work well to get people to balance things better?
I guess monitoring would be good, so that you want to make sure they're not doing things they shouldn't be doing, but also if you have good bonuses, then they'll try and get what they need to get done, and not try and do things that they don't.
Did you have an idea?
I mean, it seems to me that sales made or things like this could be measured.
Yeah.
But you can't there wouldn't be an incentive for someone to do it unless it was a soft incentive, because that's more of an intrinsic motivation to do something bad.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think softer incentives tend to work better in these cases where it's hard to measure things, right? When there's important things that can't be measured, something like professionalism in the military, like instilling the military in Colombia with the idea that you protect civilians, you don't hurt civilians. Giving them a lot of drills and training and that type of stuff can be a much more effective incentive mechanism than can paying them for doing this when there's these unmeasurable things. I think we actually have to move on, so I'm sorry about that. A final incentive problem that a lot of people have been talking about recently is what's called overstaying your welcome. So this is a case when managers really want to stay in a job, and they don't, even if they're not the right person to do it anymore. So this is a big problem that happens in startup companies. So often someone like Mark Zuckerberg will say, I want to be running Facebook. Now Mark Zuckerberg was not really a business